Hello there, what is going on, everybody? Today we're talking about Star Wars Legion and the possibility that new factions could be in development, in the works, or at least in the planning phases based on, admittedly, a small blurb from a recent article, but it did get my gears sort of stirring. And I know some people are going to say this was clickbait. There are no new factions. Of course, there are no new factions, at least right now. But there was some very deliberate verbiage in a recent article that has sort of opened the door to why would they have said it that way, and unless they wanted to, potentially hint about new factions coming. And I won't be surprised if we do hear about new factions coming within the next year. Adepticon 2026 is supposed to be full of surprises, according to the rumor mill. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into this. Quick disclaimer, again, if you're new here to the channel, or if you're returning, if you haven't been here a while, there's a new round of the $25 Amazon gift card giveaway. We got a couple more days on that going still, so you just have to be a subscriber and leave a comment on this or one of my other videos. Let me know what you would want to see from a new faction coming to Star Wars Legion. So first, let's talk a little bit about this article. So they posted an article on August 12th that was sort of like a primer, like a new player introduction into the different factions and the armies of Star Wars Legion. And we're talking about some of the new commanders and some of the fundamentals of leading them. But this line here, that's again right before the Darth Vader art, and I'm going to put a link to the article in the video description below. It says, "Read on as we introduce the current Star Wars Legion factions and the units that comprise their armies." Now, yes, the word current was, of course, a deliberate inclusion, and maybe I'm reading too deep into it, because why does it say current? Why would you need to have the current armies in there? That doesn't make sense, does it? Like, why wouldn't you just say, as we were introduced the Star Wars Legion factions? Because frankly, saying factions would be perfectly fine, but they put current Star Wars Legion factions in there because almost as if they plan to introduce some, and this article is still potentially relevant, like perhaps within the next year. It's a possibility. It's definitely possible because of the way they worded that. That's obviously where I'm making this whole video from. But whether or not that's true, whether or not they are hinting at new factions, it's still a cool discussion topic to talk about anyway. So that's what I want to talk about in this video. So now, to be fair, we have battle forces already. And, battle forces are sort of sub-factions. Think of them as that. I kind of would have preferred the term sub-factions, but they went with battle forces. But basically, it's like a faction within a faction. It's a special way that you can build a list and, build an Imperial list that's, Blizzard Force, or build an Imperial list that's, an Imperial Remnant, or build, rebels that are the Hoth specific guys with echo-based defenders, right? It's a way to do things like that are a little bit more specific and kind of sub-faction oriented. And some factions it's easier to do that with than others. And there's definitely a lot of battle forces or sub-factions that the game probably needs to see, but that's not really where this is going. So the first is one I think is coming sooner rather than later, and I think it could either work as a battle force or its own faction. And we've talked about this before, but that's going to be Dathomir. I feel like Dathomir was neutral enough during the Clone Wars that they really stood apart, and I could easily see them being their own dedicated faction rather than just a battle force under the Separatists. If you had to align them with anybody, it would definitely be Separatists, because they were, working with them at least part of the time. But they very quickly established themselves as, no, we're not, you're not our master. We do what we want. And they paid the price for that. But I think there's enough within Dathomir that it could be its own faction. There's more stuff with Dathomir potentially coming. They keep visiting Dathomir in different video games and with different shows, and possibly even this movie that's going to be coming up, Ahsoka Season 2, is going to have a lot to do with Dathomir. And we're just getting a lot more with Dathomir and the Night Sisters and the Night Brothers in the video games, and we've got all these characters, and of course Savage Opress is also coming. And again, there's nothing, just because a miniature is coming presumably to the Separatists, it doesn't mean that you couldn't also be a mark, that you couldn't also do additional versions of that character to work, one way or the other. You could even potentially make the case to say Savage Opress wouldn't even work with the Night Sisters, because we didn't actually see that. I mean, you could do it one way or the other. You could do a pre-magic Savage Opress, or a post, Sith indoctrination Savage Opress. There's a lot of different ways you could do all of this, but there's so much between the Jedi Outcast stuff that's on Dathomir, Ahsoka, and on dealing with all of the Night Sister witch magic and all of that stuff. You've also got all of the Clone Wars things. There's Morgan Elsbeth and all of her ties. There's so much that you can do, plus with zombies and rancors, and again, all of the things that happen on Dathomir. It just makes a lot of sense. I think it would be awesome. Let me know what you think down in the comments section below. I also want to talk about Mandalorians. People have often said, how come we don't have a Mandalorian battle force? And it's an interesting question talking about a Mandalorian battle force, because Mandalorians have allegiances. They're shattered. They're all over the place. What faction would get the Mandalorian battle force? Should any faction get a Mandalorian battle force? Or can we look back to the Clone Wars era when Mandalore was truly neutral? They were neutral. They were good guys, but they weren't going to ally with the Republic. There was a lot of splits in a lot of different ways. Mandalore as a whole, as their own faction, has easily enough stuff to justify an entire faction, as well as not only just a faction, and the same thing with Dathomir, but they could also have specific battle forces within Mandalore. You could have a Death Watch unit or a Death Watch battle force that is only certain parts of Mandalore. And it would allow you to pull double duty on a lot of characters that have served. Like, you can have Bo-Katan in Mandalore, and then maybe she also has a Republic version, or even also has a Rebel version. There's a lot, just like Ahsoka. Mandalore just goes deep, and again, you have a whole resurgence of Mandalorians that span the eon, that span the ages and the eras. From Clone Wars, you can go back to old Republic Mandalore. You can go into the future of the Mandalorian timeline and all of the Mandalorian and the cults and the sub factions. You can have a This Is the Way cult, right? And all kinds of cool stuff like that. You can do battle forces within Mandalore as its own faction, and it's just a cool concept. And I would love to see them really dig into it. Maybe they would have to restrict it to a specific timeline. Maybe it would be, just the Satine era timeline of Clone Wars era Mandalore. But even just then, you still have an awful lot. But I feel like there's so much that so many named characters too that you can do, and you've got different costumes. Not everybody looks like Boba Fett. There's a lot of other roles that Mandalorians can do. And it'd be really cool, frankly. It'd be really cool. So, I want to point out also, I'm not mentioning Gungans, even though I'd love to talk about Gungans. I'm not talking about Gungans at all in this video, because I don't really see Gungans being their own separate standalone army. I see Gungans more as being a Republic battle force, and Republic aligned with having a Gungan battle force or a Naboo battle force. So I don't feel like I should even talk about Gungans at all in this whole video, so that's why you won't hear me say Gungan one time in this video. But I don't want you to think that I forgot about them. But I don't think they belong here. But if you disagree, be sure to let me know. #Gungan. Moving forward. Maybe it's time to revisit the Shadow Collective. Well, they've always kind of been viewed as Legion's 5th faction, even though they're not a faction, but they kind of are, but they're not, but they kind of are, but they're not. It's one of those weird situations. Because they have mercs that can't go anywhere except in the Shadow Collective. Maybe it's just time to just say, you know what? We can call them their own faction. Maybe that will happen. Maybe there's some new things that have to happen with the Shadow Collective to make that happen. We have Hondo coming with pirates. They're going to be able you're going to be able to run weak weight pirates. They have a tank that's coming. So as Shadow Collective is going to be getting more filled out and having more options available, maybe this is time to revisit how they are structured. It could be as simple as just, these guys are actually going to be made into a fully fledged faction. That's a possibility. I don't know if they're really going to do that right on the heels of doing reprints, or what's going to happen with all that. Although if they did release like a separate faction starter for these guys, then that would work. And I think with the way that they're doing starters now does allow them to more easily add a single faction rather than having to come up with a new 2-player starter. And I love the idea of 2-player starters, and hopefully they'll revisit those in the future. But single faction buy-in entry points is a great way to go to add a single faction, and they could do something like that for the Shadow Collective, possibly. It would be interesting. But maybe we break up the Shadow Collective a little bit, because I'd love to see Black Sun become an actual faction. Maybe the Shadow Collective stays as they are, as just this subset of certain groups that fell under Maul and worked for him and his Shadow Collective, and maybe we get, maybe while they continue to get more stuff, we also get a way to run Black Sun proper, and we get certain characters named Black Sun characters. Now, Black Sun doesn't have too much depth, but again, it's become sort of a cult classic for the Shadows of the Empire stuff. If we ever do want to see Zizor and Guri and Dash Rendar and all of this stuff from that book finally show up, and again, I think it's, as time goes by, I think Disney has kind of eased a lot of the restrictions on the EU or the Legends stuff. They've sort of come around, I think, and embraced that, and it's been long enough that I think fans would eat up a chance to see a recanonization, or at least a arms wide open sort of embracement of Legends stuff. And this is a great way to do that in Star Wars Legion, by introducing Black Sun proper. I'd love to see them be an actual faction. But I think who has a better chance of doing that would be the Pikes. The Pikes had a lot of really cool screen time in the Book of Boba Fett, especially with those Scorpionik giant heavy mechs, which are absolutely spectacular. And the fact that you had 2 of them on screen means that, again, you can run 2 heavies in a faction, right? Like, it just, ever since I watched the Book of Boba Fett, I'm like, I've got to have Pikes. I've got to have the Scorpionik. You could put it in Shadow Collective, but it makes a lot more sense to give it to Pikes specifically if you're going to run Pikes as their own individual faction. We've seen a lot of Pikes in the Clone Wars, and then, of course, having them on screen in Book of Boba Fett made them a lot more recognizable to modern audiences. So I think the Pikes might have a little bit of marketability, and it could be real fun. And again, the cool thing about either using Black Sun or the Pikes or the Mandalorians is that you have units from the Shadow Collective that all already exist, and that you could kind of use. You wouldn't have to develop too many new things. You've already got cores. You already have some officers. You've got some. You've already got some of the fundamentals for that faction, and you wouldn't have to completely start from the ground up developing a new faction. But so far up to this point, I've just been talking about new things that could be faction ideas based in the current timelines that we already have in Star Wars Legion. And I think really what's one of the things that is very likely is sooner or later, maybe later for some people, and again, this is going to be one that you guys disagree on, I think they're going to have to go into the sequel trilogy timeline at some point. It just makes sense. And what better way to start doing that than with the First Order? Resistance never really felt much like a faction to me. They felt more like a battle force, if anything. But the First Order is a fully fledged faction with heroes, operatives, leaders, named characters, lots of nameless troops, lots of specialty troops. Again, they might be seen as being a little bit too similar to the Empire from certain perspectives, but they have a cool look to them. Kylo Ren looks cool. Captain Phasma looks cool. Not only do you have the stuff from the movies, but you also have the show Star Wars Resistance, where you have like a gold stormtrooper and a red stormtrooper and things like that, right? Actually, I don't think the red stormtrooper was there. I think he was Captain Cardinal. He was from one of the books. But you do have certain things like that. There probably needs to be a little bit more in the sequel trilogy in the future timeline to flush these things out. Mandalorian seemed like it was going that direction. A lot of things seemed like it was hinting towards all of that stuff. Some of the things probably need to be flushed out a little bit more, but I do think that this is an eventuality for Star Wars Legion. The First Order has so much stuff that would work. There's already been fan versions of it as well. It could be a really cool one. And it might look really awesome on the table, especially like I could see them doing some really classic Kylo Ren poses where when he kind of jerks the saber on for the very first time you saw Kylo Ren in that very first trailer, and he had that crossguard saber kind of ignited out to the side. It was really cool. Again, you can have great table presence with a lot of this stuff. And then look at the Battle of Crate. Of course, you've got vehicles there that are just too big, right? So maybe you need to wait for Grand Army. I don't know, but it's a cool thought. And then likewise with here the Resistance, there's not enough Resistance stuff to make an army out of. You could make them like a rebel battle force, kind of like how Shadow Collective is. You make like an old version of Luke and Leia and Han and certain heroes. But you could still use like rebel troopers and stuff like that. I don't know. They just don't have enough on-screen stuff to really justify it. I think I feel like the Resistance has more of a navy than anything else. Like if they were going to do Armada, the Resistance had enough different ship types, that were featured that you could have gotten away with that. But as far as ground troops and like vehicles and supports and heavies and stuff like that, you're just gonna have a really hard time because again, they were hit and run. They were a smaller group than the Rebellion even. So I just don't think they had enough. But the First Order, and since you have individual starters now too, you don't have to have a 2-player starter that's perfectly balanced. You can have just the First Order and then figure out the Resistance. Everybody could be the Resistance, That's the beauty of these tabletop games. Your battles don't have to be canonically accurate. They can be really fun. And we can go into different timelines as well. If you've seen The Acolyte, or if you've read any of the High Republic books, there's a lot of stuff there. They started like a whole new era, and you have a lot of Jedi. They have a distinct look to them. They have lots of different colored lightsabers. You have a lot of different named characters. It could be a very Jedi-focused faction. You could have a unique faction identity that maybe they don't focus so much on ground troops. Maybe you can run an all lightsaber type of battle force that is, again, if Legion's really going to continue to grow, when I play certain Warhammer games, they have a lot of different armies, and a lot of them have very different play styles. There are armies that are completely melee focused that have very little ranged, or the range they have isn't super powerful and stuff. Then there's armies that are more magic focused, and there's armies that are more shooting focused, and there's armies that are more movement focused, and so on and so forth. But like the High Republic, an army full of Jedi would be a really cool thing. Conversely, there are multiple different bad guys in the High Republic, but the main antagonists are the Nihil, and they would be they're actually cooler than the High Republic, than the Jedi or the High Republic at the time. Like the Nihil are like scavengers, and they all wear masks, and they're like steampunk, cyberpunk, maelstrom kind of guys, and they use wild and crazy tactics. Saw Gerrera would approve if he agreed with their goals, right? There's a lot of biological and chemical warfare that they do, and they're evil, pure evil, almost for the sake of being evil, right? Like a lot of Mad Max kind of crazy, creepy, scary vibes from the Nihil. They would be super cool in Star Wars Legion, and the way that they're written, it totally works. So I'd love, like, this whole, and this era gained some popularity with some really well written books, and then it seemed like with the Acolyte, it was gonna, they had finally done some things that were kind of in this timeline, or like kind of at the tail end of this timeline. and it was going to get a little more stuff, and it still could happen. I don't know if it's recognizable or popular enough for them to do it right now, but it could happen. And we could go back even further to the Old Republic, and you could actually do like Sith, and 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 all of these races that they had in the Old Republic. You could do a Sith faction. You could do an Old Republic faction. You could do some weird stuff, or they had Chiss and all kinds of really cool Old Republic stuff. You could just visit the Old Republic, and that could be a whole new launch for Star Wars Legion. Old Republic factions, and have it be fully compatible with the rest of stuff. I think going Old Republic, especially if you went to like Knights of the Old Republic timeline and you had Revan and Malak and Bastila Shan and all of these other stuff too, I think there's a lot of really cool stuff that you could do with all of that, and also incorporate Star Wars the Old Republic and like there's a lot of characters from that storyline too. And let me know if you guys have ever played this MMO. It's something I played when it first came out that I had gotten away from, but I had some good memories and some good times playing it. But again, there's a lot of different eras they could go into if they want to do stuff like that. They haven't yet. And I feel like they're testing the waters a little bit with Shatterpoint, because they have eras as a more distinct thing in Shatterpoint. It's a way for them to kind of gauge, like, is this going to be a popular era? We can just make like 1 or 2 packs for First Order and see. We can just make 1 or 2 packs for the Old Republic and see. And if there are best sellers, then maybe we should move forward with Legion armies and stuff like that. It's a possibility. So again, that's a whole lot of exposition based on just a small blurb that might not have meant much of anything. But hopefully it was an enjoyable discussion. Hopefully it got some of your thoughts ticking. It's one of the ways that my brain works. So again, I'm sorry if some people are gonna just talk a lot of trash and say, oh, this was all clickbait, but it really wasn't. It was a discussion about new factions for Star Wars Legion. Could they do it? They're obviously keeping the door open. At a minimum, they're keeping the door open for that content with this type of thing right there. And I'm sure, I don't think they would be responsible game developers if they hadn't at least considered adding new factions to the game. You've got a new you've got new individual faction starters. You've laid all of the groundwork to allow for this sort of thing. So of course you would keep the door open for things like that. Why would you ever close those doors? Of course they wouldn't do that. So there's no harm at all in discussing what new factions might look like and talking about what you want to see. And that's the beauty of it all. And the discussion doesn't have to end here. You can let me know what you think down in the comments section below. You can also jump into our Discord, which is also linked in the video description, and share your thoughts there as well. That's going to do it for today's video. I want to thank you all so much for watching. Big thanks to my patrons. You guys are amazing and help make this whole channel possible. May the Force be with you. Live long and prosper. Be excellent to each other, party on, dudes. So say we all, and always wash your socks.